Music brought back the grandfather's memory. The afternoon sun filtered through the gauze curtains of the small apartment in Portland, Oregon, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor that had borne witness to 3 generations of Henderson family life. Marcus stood in the doorway of his grandfather's room, watching the elderly man sit motionless in his leather armchair, the same chair where he had once read bedtime stories to Marcus, where he had taught him the basics of chess, where countless conversations about life, love, and dreams had unfolded over the years. Now William sat there staring at nothing in particular through the window that overlooked the quiet residential street lined with 100-year-old oak trees, their leaves turning gold and crimson in the October chill. The sounds of the city seemed distant here, muffled by the weight of silence that had settled over their lives like dust on forgotten furniture. Occasionally, a car would pass by, its tires whispering against the damp asphalt, or a bird would call from the massive oak tree that dominated their front yard. But these sounds seemed to exist in another world, one that William Henderson could no longer access. The grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom, ticked steadily, marking time that had lost all meaning for the man who had once lived by precise rhythms and carefully measured beats. William Henderson, once the most vibrant storyteller in the entire neighborhood, the man who could hold court at any gathering with his tales of adventure and romance, now sat trapped in a prison of his own fading mind. Marcus remembered the days when his grandfather would gather the family around the dinner table, his eyes sparkling with mischief and memory as he recounted tales from his days as a jazz musician in the clubs of Chicago during the 60s. Those hands that now lay still in his lap, weathered and spotted with age, had once coaxed magic from piano keys, filling smoky venues with melodies that made people forget their troubles and lose themselves in the rhythm of the night. He had played alongside legends, shared stages with names that would go down in jazz history, and had stories about each encounter that he could spin into gold. The diagnosis had come 18 months ago, delivered on a grey Tuesday morning that Marcus would never forget. Alzheimer's, the doctor had said, with that practiced combination of professionalism and sympathy that medical professionals perfect over years of delivering bad news. Dr. Sarah Chen had explained the progression they could expect, the medications that might slow but not stop the inevitable decline, the support services available to families facing this journey. Since then, Marcus had watched his grandfather slowly disappear, piece by piece, memory by memory, like a photograph left in the sun, fading until only the faintest outline remained. The man who had once been able to recall every detail of a performance from 40 years ago now couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast, couldn't recognize his own reflection, let alone the grandson who had moved back home from Seattle to care for him. Marcus entered the room quietly, his sneakers barely making a sound on the Persian rug that Margaret, his grandmother, had bought on their 20th anniversary trip to Turkey. Every object in this room held a story, but the storyteller could no longer tell them. He sat down on the ottoman near his grandfather's chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight, and studied the older man's face. The deep lines etched there told stories that William could no longer remember, each wrinkle a chapter in a book whose pages had been scattered to the wind. There was the small scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident, the laugh lines that spoke of years of joy, the worry lines that had deepened when Marcus's father had gone to war and deepened further when he hadn't come home. The afternoon light caught the silver in his grandfather's hair, still thick despite his 83 years, and for a moment Marcus could almost see the younger man he had been, handsome and confident, with a smile that could light up any room he entered. In old photographs scattered throughout the apartment, that man still existed, frozen in time, his arm around Margaret at their wedding, holding his newborn son, teaching a young Marcus to play the piano, but the living, breathing man before him seemed disconnected from those captured moments. "Hey, Grandpa," Marcus said softly, though he knew there would be no response. He had tried everything in the past months, showing William photo albums, playing old home videos on his laptop, even bringing in Mr. James from across the street, who had been William's best friend for 30 years. Nothing had sparked more than a momentary flicker of confusion. William's eyes remained fixed on some invisible point beyond the window, perhaps seeing something that existed only in the fragments of his broken memory, or perhaps seeing nothing at all. The silence stretched between them, heavy and impenetrable, like a wall that grew higher with each passing day, brick by brick, built from lost words and forgotten names. Marcus reached out and gently touched his grandfather's hand, feeling the calluses that remained from years of playing piano, permanent reminders of a life dedicated to music. The skin was paper-thin now, mapped with veins like rivers on an ancient chart, cool to the touch despite the warmth of the room. There was no response, no flicker of recognition, no squeeze of acknowledgement, just the steady rise and fall of William's chest, proof that life still resided in this body, even if the essence of the man seemed to have departed for some unreachable place. The following morning arrived grey and drizzly, typical for Portland in late October, with clouds hanging low over the city like a wool blanket. Marcus stood in the kitchen preparing his grandfather's breakfast, the routine so familiar he could do it with his eyes closed. He measured out the oatmeal precisely, added exactly 1 teaspoon of honey, the way William had always liked it, though Marcus wondered if his grandfather could even taste the difference anymore. Orange juice in the blue cup that William had always favoured, a wedding gift from 58 years ago that had somehow survived all the moves, all the years, all the changes that life had brought. The medications were carefully counted out and placed in the small plastic organizer, each pill a small attempt to slow the inexorable tide of forgetting. As he worked, the morning news played softly on the radio, stories of elections and economics, of conflicts in distant places, none of which would mean anything to William anymore. His world had shrunk to this apartment, to the view from his window, to the faces of caregivers he didn't recognize. Marcus's eyes fell upon the old Victrola in the corner of the living room, covered with a white sheet like a ghost from another era, like a monument to better times when music had filled these rooms with life and laughter. The antique record player had belonged to William's father, brought over from Germany in 1923 when the family had emigrated, seeking a new life in America. It had survived the Depression, the Second World War, and countless moves as the family had built their American dream. Marcus remembered being fascinated by it as a child, watching his grandfather's reverent ritual of selecting a record, carefully cleaning it with a soft cloth, placing it on the turntable with the delicacy of a surgeon. The needle would find its groove with a satisfying pop before music would fill the room, transforming their ordinary living space into a concert hall, a dance floor, a time machine. William would close his eyes and sway to the rhythm, his face transformed by the music, years falling away like autumn leaves. Sometimes he would pull Marcus's grandmother into an impromptu dance, spinning her around the living room while she laughed and protested that dinner would burn. Those moments had seemed infinite then, stretching out like summer afternoons, but now they existed only in Marcus's memory, and soon, perhaps, not even there. An idea began to form in Marcus's mind, tentative at first, like a seed pushing through hard soil toward the light. It was born of desperation as much as hope, a last attempt to reach across the growing darkness that separated them. Music had been such a fundamental part of his grandfather's life, the language he spoke most fluently, the air he breathed. Even when words began to fail him in the early stages of his illness, William could still hum melodies, his fingers sometimes moving across invisible keys, playing concerts for an audience that existed only in his mind. Perhaps, Marcus thought, Perhaps music could reach him where words could not, could find those neural pathways that hadn't yet been destroyed, could build a bridge across the chasm that Alzheimer's had created. After helping his grandfather with breakfast, a mostly silent affair, punctuated only by the clink of silverware against ceramic and Marcus's gentle reminders to eat, to drink, to take his pills, Marcus returned to the living room. The morning light was stronger now, fighting through the clouds, casting pale rectangles across the floor. He pulled the sheet off the Victrola, revealing the mahogany wood cabinet, still gleaming despite its age, the wood grain rich and deep like frozen waves. The brass horn caught the weak morning light, and Marcus ran his fingers along its smooth surface, feeling the weight of history in this simple object, the accumulated memories of 4 generations of music lovers. He opened the cabinet below, where dozens of records sat in their paper sleeves, each one a time capsule waiting to be opened, a message from the past waiting to be decoded. The smell hit him immediately, that particular combination of old paper, vinyl, and wood polish that transported him instantly to childhood Sunday afternoons. His fingers moved through the collection, reading the labels with their faded typography, some in his great-grandfather's careful German script, others added by William over the years. Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Billie Holiday, Sarah Vaughan, names that had once meant everything to his grandfather, artists who had been not just musicians but friends, colleagues, fellow travelers on the journey of jazz. Then he found it. The record he had been unconsciously searching for, his fingers stopping as if guided by instinct. Moonlight Serenade by Glenn Miller, the surface worn but cared for, the label slightly faded but still legible. This was the song his grandparents had danced to at their wedding in 1962, the melody that had played when William proposed to Margaret on a starlit evening in Laurelhurst Park, getting down on one knee beside the pond while the ducks looked on as witnesses. Margaret had told Marcus the story countless times, her eyes misting with the memory, how William had hired a violinist to hide in the bushes and play their song at just the right moment, how she had said yes before he even finished asking. Marcus carried the record like a precious artifact, like the holy grail of his grandfather's memory, handling it with the same care William had always shown. He wound the crank to power the mechanism, feeling the resistance of the spring, the mechanical precision of German engineering still functioning after nearly a century. He placed the record on the turntable and gently set the needle down, holding his breath as it found the groove. For a moment, there was only the soft crackle of the old vinyl, the sound of decades compressed into these tiny grooves, the static of time itself. Then the music began, soft and sweet, the clarinet's voice rising like smoke, filling the room with its nostalgic melody. Marcus returned to his grandfather's room, leaving the door open so the music could drift in like a gentle breeze, carrying the scent of memories. The melody wound through the hallway, past the photographs on the walls, past the certificates and awards that documented a life well lived, into the room where William sat in his perpetual twilight. At first, there was no reaction, his gaze still fixed on that invisible horizon that only he could see, his body still except for the autonomous rhythm of breathing. But as the saxophone joined the clarinet, their voices intertwining in a conversation across time, Marcus noticed something. It was subtle, so subtle he thought at first he might be imagining it, projecting his desperate hope onto the smallest movement. His grandfather's index finger, resting on the worn arm of his chair, began to move. It was barely perceptible, just the slightest lift and fall, but it was there, unmistakably keeping time with the rhythm. Marcus held his breath, afraid that any movement, any sound, might break whatever spell was being woven, might sever this gossamer thread of connection. The tapping grew stronger, more deliberate, as if William's body was remembering something his mind had forgotten, as if the music was bypassing the damaged pathways and speaking directly to some deeper part of him. His foot joined in, a gentle pat against the footrest, finding the beat with an accuracy that surprised Marcus. It was like watching a statue slowly come to life, animation returning to features that had been frozen for so long. The young man watched, transfixed, as colour seemed to return to his grandfather's face, a flush of life spreading across his cheeks like sunrise breaking over mountains, like spring returning after a long, hard winter. Then, incredibly, miraculously, William's lips began to move. At first it was just a whisper, so soft Marcus had to lean in to hear it, had to strain to catch the words beneath the music. But there they were, emerging from some deep place that Alzheimer's hadn't been able to reach, a vault of memory that music had just unlocked. I stand at your gate, and the song that I sing is of moonlight, William sang, his voice cracked and thin but unmistakably his own, carrying the ghost of the powerful baritone it had once been. I stand, and I wait for the touch of your hand in the June night. Tears rolled freely down Marcus's face now, but he didn't care, didn't even try to wipe them away. They were tears of joy, of relief, of a grief he hadn't even known he was carrying suddenly lifted. He watched as his grandfather's eyes, those eyes that had been vacant for so long, began to focus, like a camera lens finding its subject after searching through blur. William blinked once, twice, as if awakening from a long sleep, as if surprised to find himself in this room, in this moment, in this body. When he looked at Marcus, there was recognition there, real and undeniable, a spark of the man he had been. "Marcus," he said, his voice uncertain but present, questioning but aware. "Is that you, son? What are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in Seattle at that job of yours?" The confusion in his voice was different now. Not the vacant confusion of dementia, but the simple disorientation of someone trying to piece together a timeline that had become jumbled. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't trust his voice not to break completely, so he simply nodded and took his grandfather's hand, feeling the warmth that had returned to it. William squeezed back, his grip surprisingly strong, anchoring them both in this moment of clarity. This unexpected gift of connection. "I'm here, Grandpa," Marcus finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm right here with you." The music continued to play, and with each note, more memories seemed to surface, like photographs developing in solution, gradually revealing their images. William began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, about the night he had proposed to Margaret, how nervous he had been, how he had practiced the speech 100 times but forgotten every word when the moment came. He talked about their first dance as husband and wife, how Margaret had whispered in his ear that he was stepping on her dress, and how they had laughed about it for years afterward. He remembered the jazz clubs where he had played his heart out to crowds of eager listeners, the smell of cigarette smoke and perfume, the way the stage lights had made everything beyond the first row disappear into darkness. He talked about the night he had played with Duke Ellington's orchestra, just one night when their regular pianist had fallen ill, but what a night it had been. The way Duke had nodded at him after his solo, just a small nod, but it had meant everything. William talked about Marcus's father as a boy, teaching him to ride a bike in the park, the scraped knees and triumphant smiles. He remembered birthday parties with homemade cakes that Margaret had decorated with such care, Christmas mornings when the living room floor disappeared under a sea of wrapping paper, family vacations to the Oregon coast where they would build elaborate sandcastles that the tide would inevitably claim. The memories came in waves, some crystal clear and detailed, others fragmented and dreamlike, but all of them real, all of them precious, all of them proof that William Henderson was still there, still fighting to exist despite the disease that sought to erase him. Marcus grabbed his phone and began recording, knowing that this moment might not last, wanting to preserve these stories, this voice, this connection that had been lost and miraculously found again. William didn't seem to notice or care about the device. He was lost in his own narrative, his hands moving expressively as he painted pictures with words of a life fully lived, a life that had mattered, a life that had touched so many others. The days that followed became a new routine, one built on hope and music rather than mere maintenance and medication. Every morning Marcus would set up the Victrola, the ritual of it becoming almost sacred. He would select different records from William's collection, each one a potential key that might unlock another door in his grandfather's mind. Some days were better than others. The disease was still there, still progressing, but now they had a weapon against it, a way to fight back, even if only temporarily. Sometimes the music would bring moments of stunning clarity, where William would recognize not just Marcus, but also the parade of visitors who began to come once word spread about the miracle of the music. Mrs. Chen from next door, who had lived there for 20 years, would bring homemade dumplings and sit with them, and William would remember her husband, who had passed 5 years ago, would ask about her grandchildren by name. Tom, the mail carrier who had been delivering letters to their house for 15 years, would stop in on his lunch break, and William would recall the day Tom had helped him fix the fence after a storm. Pastor David from the church where William had once sung in the choir would visit, and they would harmonize on old hymns, William's voice finding strength in the familiar melodies. The pastor would often leave with tears in his eyes, moved by the power of faith and music combined, by the evidence that something essential in William remained untouchable by disease. Other days, the music seemed to reach William in different ways. Even when words failed and recognition didn't come, when the fog was too thick for memories to penetrate, William would hum along, his body swaying gently to rhythms embedded so deeply in his memory that not even Alzheimer's could fully erase them. His fingers would move across invisible keys, playing along with the records, and sometimes Marcus could identify the songs just from watching his grandfather's hands, knowing the pieces so well from years of watching him play. Marcus learned to treasure these moments too, understanding that connection didn't always require words or even conscious recognition. Sometimes it was enough just to share space, to breathe the same air, to let the music build a bridge between them, even if William couldn't consciously cross it. The music became their shared language, speaking what words could no longer convey. The transformation didn't go unnoticed by the medical community. Dr. Sarah Chen made special trips to observe their sessions, bringing colleagues and medical students to witness what she called a remarkable case of music therapy's potential. She would sit quietly in the corner, taking notes as William sang along to Ella Fitzgerald, his voice harmonizing with the recording in a way that spoke to years of musical training, muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. "This is extraordinary," she told Marcus after one particularly good session where William had not only sung but had also told stories about meeting Ella at a club in Chicago. "We know that music can reach Alzheimer's patients in unique ways, that it's processed in parts of the brain that are often last to be affected by the disease. But this level of response, this consistency, it's remarkable. You've given him a gift, a way back to himself, even if temporarily. We're learning so much from this." Word spread through their Portland neighborhood about the daily concerts at the Henderson House. What started as a private moment between grandfather and grandson evolved into something larger, something that touched the entire community. Friends and neighbors began dropping by, bringing their own records to share, adding their voices to the songs. It became a daily gathering, informal and organic, timed around the afternoon when William was usually most alert. Mrs. Chen brought recordings of Chinese folk songs that her own mother had loved, songs from a culture and language foreign to William. And surprisingly, he responded to these too, his musical ear appreciating the melodies, even if the words were incomprehensible. His hands would move as if trying to find the right keys to accompany these new songs, and sometimes he would hum harmonies that somehow worked, that showed his deep intuitive understanding of music's universal language. Mr. James, from across the street, William's old friend who had seemed like a stranger to him just weeks before, contributed his collection of Motown hits. When the Temptations came on, William not only recognized the songs, but stood up and executed a pretty impressive spin move, muscle memory from nights spent dancing with Margaret at the Apollo Ballroom flooding back. The room erupted in applause, and William took a bow, his face beaming with a showman's pride. These gatherings became more than just music sessions. They became community events, moments of connection that enriched not just William's life, but everyone who participated. Marcus watched his grandfather become once again the center of attention, the entertainer, the storyteller, even if his stories now came in fragments and his entertainment was more participation than performance. The living room that had been so quiet, so heavy with silence, now rang with laughter and song every afternoon. Young Tommy from down the street, a shy 12-year-old who was learning piano, started coming by with his mother. William, on his clearer days, would sit beside him on the piano bench and guide his hands, teaching him jazz progressions and improvisation techniques. Even when William couldn't remember Tommy's name, couldn't place him in any context, his hands would still correct the boy's fingering, would still demonstrate the proper way to voice a chord. It was teaching at its most fundamental level, knowledge passed from one generation to another through touch and sound, rather than words. One particularly memorable afternoon, as autumn gave way to winter and the first snow of the season began to fall outside their window, William had his clearest day in months. The snow seemed to trigger something, and he began talking about a winter years ago when Marcus was just 5, how they had built a snowman in the backyard, and William had given it his favorite fedora to wear. Marcus remembered that day too, remembered how his grandfather had lifted him up to place the carrot nose, how they had used coffee beans for buttons. As Tony Bennett's The Way You Look Tonight played, the song segueing perfectly from a previous record, William stood up steady and sure, without any of the uncertainty that usually marked his movements. He straightened his shirt, smoothed back his hair with both hands in a gesture Marcus remembered from his childhood, and held out his hand formally to his grandson. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice carrying the courtly manner of a different era, when men wore suits to dinner and dancing was an art form. Marcus, laughing through his tears, accepted, and they moved together in the living room, navigating around the furniture with practiced ease. The neighbors watched and smiled, some wiping away tears of their own, all of them understanding they were witnessing something precious, something that transcended the moment. "You know," William said, his voice clear and strong, his eyes focused and present. "I may not remember everything, Marcus. Hell, most days I don't remember much at all. The names slip away, the faces become strangers, even the man in the mirror sometimes seems like someone I've never met. But this feeling, this music, this love, it's bigger than memory. It lives in a place that disease can't touch, somewhere deeper than thought, deeper than consciousness even. And as long as you keep playing these songs, as long as you keep showing up, I'll keep finding my way back to you, even if it's just for a moment, even if I forget again, as soon as the music stops." He paused, looking around the room at all the faces, some familiar, some not, but all welcomed with the same warm smile. "And that's enough, isn't it? These moments, they're like notes in a song, each one brief, but together they make something beautiful, something worth playing, something worth remembering even if the memory fades." As the song ended and the record player's needle reached the end of its groove, William's clarity began to fade once more, like a radio station slowly going out of range. The focused look in his eyes grew distant again, and his movements became uncertain. But Marcus was ready, gently guiding him back to his chair, helping him settle comfortably as the next record began to play. The Victrola continued its faithful service as the snow fell harder outside, blanketing Portland in white, muffling the sounds of the city until all that remained was the music and the quiet breathing of people sharing a moment of grace. Marcus sat beside his grandfather, holding his hand, humming along to the melodies that had become their salvation. The neighbors stayed until evening, reluctant to break the spell, each of them having found something they didn't know they were looking for in this simple gathering. In this small room, in these moments suspended between memory and forgetting, they had found something precious, something that no disease could steal, the power of music to touch the soul, to resurrect love, and to bring a grandfather home, one song at a time. It wasn't a cure, it wasn't a miracle in the traditional sense, but it was something perhaps even more valuable, proof that love finds a way, that connection transcends cognition, that the human spirit is more resilient than any disease. As Marcus helped his grandfather prepare for bed that night, William hummed continuously, a medley of all the day's songs blending into one continuous stream of melody. And even in his sleep, his fingers continued to move, playing concerts for audiences in his dreams, creating music that no one else could hear, but that was no less real for its silence. The music had brought back more than memories. It had brought back William's essence, the fundamental core of who he was, and as long as the music played, that essence would continue to shine through, flickering perhaps, but never fully extinguished.